Okay, so hi all. It is my great pleasure to have Tomás Lejarraga with me, and it's a follow-up conversation to his talk, um, talk in the DEB seminar about how experimental methods shaped views on human competence and rationality. And I remind you, if you missed this talk, which you obviously have not, you had to do, but if you happen to miss it, you can see it on the YouTube on our website. And now we will go straight forward to our question today. So, Thomas, how can you summarize your research findings for a layman?
Thank you first. Thank you, Yefim, for having me and for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit more about my work. One way to summarize what I presented at the DEP seminar is the following. In the 60s, there was an interest in exploring to what extent human judgment was accurate. And in particular, people's statistical intuitions, whether they were accurate. And there were different reasons for why there was that interest. Part of that interest came from Brunswick, from the work of Brunswick, also because of what was happening in economics, with expected utility theory being not only developed but applied, and the assumption in economics that people's inferences were Bayesian. So psychologists set out to study whether people's statistical intuitions were accurate. And statistical intuitions mean, for example, judgments of proportion, judgments of means, judgments of correlations, of variances, also inferences about these statistical properties. And what happened is that in the 60s and early 70s, the view was that people were quite accurate. The view was that people were seen as intuitive statisticians. This was the early view. But towards the end of the 70s, a new view emerged. The new view was that people's judgments and inferences were biased, that people were prone to error. This line of research was headed by Kahneman and Tversky, and it became very popular. Many people followed up on that research, and it has continued until today. The early research was quickly forgotten. The view that people's judgments and inferences were accurate was quickly forgotten. And so what Ralph Hertwig and I did was we asked why the view had changed so markedly, so drastically. And so we looked at the experimental procedure, the experimental protocols that were conducted in the early research, leading to the view of people as intuitive statisticians, and we compared that to the experiments conducted that supported the view of people as biased and prone to error. And what we observed by looking at hundreds of experiments was that early experiments involved many trials with feedback. They also involved physical stimuli. And so we think that what happened was early research allowed experimental subjects to learn from experience. These are the experiments that supported the view of people as intuitive statisticians. Towards the end of the 70s, a new way of experimenting became prevalent, and this new way of experimenting, which was not new in psychology but new in the literature of judgment and decision making, involved only a few trials. Rarely these trials involved feedback, stimuli was mostly described to participants. So experiments involved reading text, reading problems, and providing answers to these problems. And what we observe is that experiments changed from experience-based to what we call description-based experiments. And that's what Ralph Hertwig and I observed, that the change in view from intuitive statistics to biases and errors was accompanied by a change in the way of experimenting. Now, this observation has some implications. First is that the view of bias and error that became so prevalent is not or we think is not as general as we initially thought. Biases and errors exist, but they seem constrained to a particular set of learning environments, in particular environments that do not allow or are not conducive to learning because they don't involve many trials and feedback. That's one implication, that biases are not as general as we thought. And another implication is that the fact that we observe bias and error doesn't seem to reveal a property of human cognition as much as a property of the learning environment. It seems that the accuracy of judgment depends largely on the learning conditions of the environment. That's another implication. Another implication is that policy design that builds on the assumption that people are biased and prone to error should be taken with some caution, because in some environments, namely those that allow people to learn, then bias and error are less prevalent. Okay, so that's the way I would summarize my research to lay people.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So is my understanding, do I understand correctly what you basically say is that we are doing mistakes less often than is maybe presented in the literature, and the biases is more a feature of the experimental task than will happen in the real world?
That's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it is that if you look at experiments that followed up this change in view, because what we claim is that our literature view or our review of the experimental literature is not a causal claim, because we are comparing experiments that did only experience-based methods with experiments that did only description-based methods. But what happened relatively recently is that some researchers designed experiments to test whether biases continue to emerge in experience-based experiments. And in many occasions, in many experiments, those biases are reduced. Sometimes they disappear, and sometimes they are reversed. And so I think what that reveals is that these biases are
not stable,
depend to a large extent on the learning conditions of the experiment. Now, the question is whether biases are less prevalent in the real world requires a study of the real world. So what is the real world like? What judgments and inferences in the real world are we interested in? Are those more description-based, or are those more experience-based? I think there are both. Some very important decisions are description-based. So we have to understand in what way we make description-based decisions and whether we make mistakes in those decisions. But not every decision is description-based.
Yes,
As you
some
know.
will argue even that most of the decisions are experience-based, especially if you allow for the experience of other people. Is it for you an experience or a description?
Yes, but I think that to be confident about claiming what is the real world like, I think there we need to look at the environment more systematically.
Another important question related to what you said about the decision from experience. Do I understand your claim correctly? Because what you say is that in decision from experience, there are less biases, or learning usually leads to more maximization in a sense, right? And what is your view about other researchers' findings that in some situations learning can impair your decisions, like you can be stuck in a local maxima or in experiments with rare outcomes, which are very important, so you can learn to behave less optimally.
Yes. So the literature review that we did, if you look at the experiments that used experience-based methods, experience in those experiments is what Robin Hogarth would call kind. These are kind learning environments. Feedback is abundant, it is immediate, it is very easy to link your action to the consequence. Feedback is unbiased. So these are environments that are very conducive to learning. And people learn well in those environments. And typically, in those environments, people approach maximization. Okay? Now, this doesn't mean that every environment, that experience in any environment will lead to maximization. Some environments in which we learn from experience are not conducive to learning. For example, if in the environment there is the possibility of a rare event and your sample is small, you may not come across the rare event and you will not learn the chances of the rare event accurately. So in those environments, learning is not conducive. Sorry, experience is not conducive to learning. And then you will, as you say, you may be stuck in a local maximum. If feedback is not abundant, if feedback is delayed, if it's difficult to link action with feedback, then or if feedback is biased, then those are obstacles to learning, and then it's unlikely that people will learn accurately. My take on that is that judgments and behavior are reveal the learning properties of the environment. We don't claim that, and this should be clear, we don't claim that experience always leads to more optimal behavior. Yeah, that's not the claim. Of course, there are many biases that emerge from experience, but they don't have to do, or I think they don't have to do with faulty cognition. It has to do with the limits of the learning environment. In some environments, it's just difficult to learn. If you don't have feedback, if your opportunities to act are only a few, if you if you're evaluated in one-shot decisions, then there's little you can learn. Or if there is a lot of noise in the environment, there's very little you can learn. And then yes, behavior will be far from optimal. So our claim, first, the particular claim of the paper is, if you look at the literature, this is what you observe, that the change in view was accompanied by a change in methods. Now, if you ask me how general is the opinion that experience leads to maximization, I think experience leads to maximization as long as it is a kind learning environment. But not every environment is like that.
Yes, definitely. And marketing people try to make it not a kind learning environment in their interest. I have to admit that I not completely agree with your point of view, but it is very interesting. And we will now move on to the next question. How do you think your research findings, this one and other, can be extended, especially in the domain of decisions from experience?
Okay, given that I put emphasis in the learning environment, a natural way to follow up is to look at the environment, to pay attention to the environment. This is, of course, not new. This again is to go back to ideas of Brunswick, of Simon, of Robin Hogarth, Gigerenzer. So I think the structure of the environment can reveal interesting or important aspects of the way people decide. I give you an example in the way we are following up this work. So we usually observe, as you know, that people rely on small samples of experience. In the early research on decisions from experience, we also observed that people rely on small recent samples of experience. Now, one question you can ask is, what environmental properties would promote that people develop those tendencies, the tendencies to rely on small or recent samples? And one property that we're looking at is temporal dependence. So if we are in an environment where the most recent observations are predictive of the next ones, then relying on small recent samples makes a lot of sense. So we are doing this, for example, for the managerial environment. If you look at company level variables, industry level variables, and macroeconomic level variables, which can be proxies of what the managerial environment is like, and you plot those variables, what you observe, and you do statistics on them, what you observe is very high autocorrelation, very high temporal autocorrelation, meaning that the most recent observation is highly predictive of the next observation. And we observe this when we look at the variables structured in a monthly time period, in a quarterly time period, in an annual period. There is high autocorrelation in the managerial natural environment. Well, that would promote that the manager relies on small recent samples. Now, I know that there is some debate about whether the reliance on small samples is coupled with recent samples or with samples of any time in the sequence. I know that there is some debate about that, but this is what I mean. One feature of the environment is the temporal dependence, and looking at the environment closely can reveal aspects of the processes that people in that environment may be using. Again, this is going back to the idea that our decision processes are shaped by the structure of the environment. And so the structure of the environment will inform us about the decision processes. That's one example, but there are many other environmental properties that can be looked at.
And what do you think, following on what you said and following the debate about the recency, and can it be that people look for in their small sample for the most similar situations to the situation they're encountering now, And it happens that, for example, in the managerial decisions, the most recent situations is usually the most similar to the encountered problem. It's just hand waving to what you said
No,
before.
but I think that is an interesting hypothesis. In an environment that changes, which many people have claimed that the managerial environment is of that sort. In an environment that changes, then the most recent event is probably predictive of the next event, because older events become less similar in a changing environment. So that's a question about the environment. To what extent recent experiences are also the most similar experiences? So to what extent recency and similarity are correlated? That's the way I see your question.
Yeah, I agree with you. Basically, I think it's also a question if the environment is static or dynamic, because in the real world, the environment is almost always dynamic, while in many of our experiments, it is static. So it is, in this sense, a different environment, in a different setting, in a sense.
Exactly.
Okay. So,
by the way, but let me also clarify. It may be that people rely on small recent samples in some environments, and that people rely on a small sample of most similar experiences in other environments. Okay, I'm not claiming that reliance on small recent samples is widespread. I don't think that is the case. I think people are able to detect in what environment they are in and deploy the strategy that fits that environment. Okay, so I think that is one way to follow up, is to ask those sorts of questions. Can people detect the environment they are in? Do people deploy their decision strategies adaptively? What structures in the environment are people able to detect? And so on.
And it goes back to the first question about whatever we are good statisticians, intuitive statisticians or not, or in which situations we are a good one and in which we fail to do
Exactly.
so. This is very interesting. Okay, so now going from your research to the more general question, what is, in your opinion, the most pressing issue in the social sciences nowadays?
So I think the most pressing issue is the climate problem. It is not surprising, but that doesn't make it less pressing. So I think the climate problem is definitely the most pressing issue, and I think it's a social science problem, at least in part. It has been approached from the social sciences. People from our field see it as a learning problem, or at least it can be seen as a learning problem, because it's a wicked environment. We act, we behave. Almost any of our behaviors have an impact on the environment, but it's hard to see what that impact is. Often there is no feedback, no immediate feedback. If there is feedback, is distant, temporarily disconnected. And so it's difficult to learn in that environment. But this is a problem of risk perception. It may be that a part of the problem is the miscalibration of the climate threat. And I think people have worked on trying to reduce that miscalibration, helping people realize how threatening the climate problem is. That's one problem. A different problem, which I think is the difficult problem, is whether people, even if they are calibrated, even if they perfectly judge the climate risk accurately, whether people are willing to change the way they live, the way we live, whether we are willing to live in a less resource intensive way. And I think that's the difficult problem. Yeah, I think that's the most pressive, the most pressing social science problem. Not only the judging the risk of the climate problem accurately, but also what are we going to do about the way we live.
I completely agree with you. I'm glad that you bring this up. It is also a problem, as you said, it's also an intertemporal problem, and also the issue of free riding and herd behavior and all this stuff. And I think another difficulty here is that the incentives of people in different countries, like people in the developed world, face a different situations than people in the third world countries when some of them die each day of starvation, and then if you tell them about you have to save the environment, they say, "Oh, first I have to save myself today. I don't care about I don't have time now to care about the environment." So we kind of live in different worlds, I think.
The priorities are different in different regions of the world. Also, not every region of the world is equally responsible for the current situation, and so demanding different regions of the world to respond equally is also has an element of unfair. Yeah, I think that's the big problem we have to deal with. I don't know what the solution is, but it's probably related to changing the amount of resources we consume. Yeah, I don't know if I can give you more than that. It's just the big problem to solve. I don't have the solution.
Yeah, I see. But you guys in Europe, I have to admit, I think you are moving in the right direction with all the recycling and less traveling on planes, more on trains. So I think if the world follows on your leading example, I'm not definitely a specialist on this issue, that will be great.
Something is happening in Europe. There's also a lot of tourism, and this is also an important air travel is an important part of the problem, and tourism is not, as far as I know, is not reducing. And so, yeah, I think it goes back to what I said at the beginning. It has to do with changing the way we consume resources, and yeah, I'm not sure how we're going to do that.
Maybe it is related again to your research in the sense that if the learning will be easier, if it will be more observable, the consequences of our behavior, maybe more information will help us to behave in a more environmental friendly way. And I have to admit, by the way, I see changes to the good in the sense that, for example, in Israel, there is much more awareness and more recycling opportunities and less plastic use, I think. So there are some changes for good, obviously not everything, in the electric cars. So let's try to be optimistic. And what is, in your opinion, the most impressive finding during the last 10 years in our community or social sciences in general?
In the social sciences, I think the most impressive finding is the observation of how accurately the structure of language reflects many aspects of human thought. And so we see that the statistics of word frequency and word co-occurrence in language can predict or explain relatively well a number of judgments, judgments of categorization, judgments of risk, judgments of likability, can predict relatively more well memory search. And so this, to me, was one of the most impressive findings in the last 10 years, which I think Sudeep Bhatia summarized quite well in the last Spudum gathering in Vienna. He presented lots of research in how much, how far we can go with techniques that exploit the structure of natural language. And to me, that was impressive because it was very broad in the scope of human judgment, or broad in the scope of phenomena that it could explain. And so, of course, it has limits, but I think this is one of the most impressive findings in the social sciences. Which, by the way, brings sort of a new metaphor. The metaphor that language reveals thought. By the way, I don't think it's a new metaphor. I think linguists have had this metaphor before, but the instantiation of that metaphor became evident. And now we can see how, or to what extent, language reveals thought processes. So that's, I think, one of the most impressive findings in our field.
I completely agree with you. And maybe a related question, not sure, what is your vision for our community in the following, let's say, 10 years or so?
Okay, so I think we will see the limits of this approach. In the next 10 years, we will see how far we can go with this new metaphor, with these new techniques. How much of human judgment, inferences, and decisions we can explain by simply looking at the language, at the structure of language that people produce. Yeah, we will see how far we can go with that. So that is one. I think that is something we will see in the next 10 years. By the way, everything is moving very fast. So I think maybe 20 years from now, to see the limits of a metaphor will have taken more than a decade. But I think things are moving faster now, and within 10 years, we will see how much we can explain with this new conceptual framework. I think the other phenomenon that we may observe, and I think we are to some extent already observing, is that we've created different artificial intelligences, and we are based on language models, on large language models that behave or at least produce language, respond to us in a variety of domains, right? And I think we've created these complex systems with millions of parameters that we don't fully understand. So I think the fact that we created these systems that are able to mimic human behavior in a variety of tasks doesn't mean that we understand them. I think understanding has to do with translating, translating phenomena we observe into language that is familiar to us, or into ideas or concepts that are familiar to us. And so we've created an artificial intelligence that has complex mechanisms that we see as a black box. We cannot immediately say how an artificial intelligence will respond or behave in a particular task. And so we don't understand, although we are able to create those intelligences, we find that we don't fully understand them. And so we've doubled our task. We need to understand human behavior. So you have experimental psychologists trying to understand how people behave running experiments on real people. But now we created artificial intelligences that we don't fully understand. And so I think we sooner or later will start running experiments on artificial intelligence. How does the artificial intelligence behave? Does the artificial intelligence rely on small samples of experience? Should we start testing personality traits in artificial intelligence? Are those traits stable over time? What does it mean to be stable over time for an artificial intelligence? It probably has to do with the rate of learning of that artificial intelligence. But you can ask the same questions we ask from humans. We will eventually will have to start asking from an artificial intelligence. What's the moral character of an artificial intelligence? How would an artificial intelligence play the trolley problem? How would an artificial intelligence play the dictator game? And so on. I'm sure people are already doing this. But again, I think understanding means putting a phenomenon in your own words. And the way we try to do this is by testing theories that we are able to that we are with concepts that we are familiar with, so that we understand phenomena that we observe. And so, yeah, I think we may be seeing some of that research, trying to understand how artificial intelligence works, really.
Yes, and will it still be, as you said, will we still make decisions, or this will be decisions aided by artificial intelligence or replaced by artificial intelligence? And another related thought or question is does it really matter to understand if the human made a decision or the AI made a decision, or will it soon or later blend and there will be just decisions and it does not matter who made them? I made it, or I used the help of some technology or whatever.
Yeah. If artificial intelligence is able to mimic human decisions closely, then does it matter whether the decision was made by a human or artificial intelligence? Yeah, I think that's a different question. But an important one. But I guess my point was, we've created artificial intelligences that are so complex. But that doesn't mean we understand them. To understand them, I think we need to go back and put them in the frameworks that we are familiar with. When a teacher in primary school tells the pupil, read this text and put it in your own words, I think that's the way you test whether the child understands, whether the child is able to put the phenomenon in his or her own words. I think we will need to do something like that with artificial intelligences We observe an artificial intelligence behaving, but then we need to put it in our own frameworks. Does the artificial intelligence, what does the artificial intelligence believes? Just to give an example, maybe it has no beliefs or no representation of beliefs, but how does it look like? What does the artificial intelligence expects in this particular situation? It's possible that there is no explicit representation of expectations, but it seems that to understand how that system works, we need to put it in concepts that we are familiar with. I don't know. It's my take
The
on it.
future will show.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting indeed to untackle the black box. And Thomas, tell me please, as an accomplished scholar, what is your advice to our young listeners or young scholars who strive to succeed in academia?
Okay, so the advice is to succeed. I think.
Let's do it.
I think more junior scientists should study phenomena that they find interesting, that they like. I think you can only put sufficient hours into a problem if you're interested. I often when I say this, it comes across as you sit in your chair, in your armchair, you think about phenomena, you identify the one you like, and then you go after it. That's not what I mean. There are several aspects that make you like a topic, and my experience was that when I was a PhD student, I was working in one or two or three things, and I came across Ralph Hertwig's with Ido Erev and Greg Barron and Elke Weber's paper in 2004. And I immediately, very naturally saw what the problem was, what the implications were. And I conducted some experiments. And very soon I was in a scientific conversation. And that made me like the topic. It was not that a priori I was thinking, how interesting would it be to study decision? No, it was that I quickly felt I was engaged in a conversation with other researchers, and that made me like the topic. I felt people were reading my papers. I felt that people were expecting to see the results of my experiments. So that environment made me feel that studying that problem was interesting and fun. And I abandoned other lines of research where I didn't feel anything like that. So my point is, study what you like means trying things out, talking to people, going to conferences, see which problems you feel that you can address, and yeah, so that's my advice. Find a topic that you enjoy working in.
Find the topics that you enjoy, and then you don't have to work.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And in the end, I think that's the only way to work hard on a problem. In the end, the quality of the research is a function of how many hours you put in. And so you better find a topic that drives you to put many hours of work. That's one advice. The other advice is that the academic environment is a very interesting environment. We are surrounded by experts in one way or another. People, people that come to give seminars, our fellow colleagues in the department, they are all experts in different areas. So it's very enriching to to be part of the academic environment. So I think this is something we have to enjoy. You know, not every domain of life is surrounded by people that know a lot about a subject. And so I think this is something that we need to, or that young scholars should learn to enjoy. You know, so when you come across a colleague, you have an expert there that can tell you something very interesting about any phenomenon, or people that come and give seminars. These are all experts in their particular fields. And so find the topic that you like and enjoy the academic environment, which is very, very enriching.
And work hard. I think your advices are even more general, not only in the scholar environment, but in general, a way to succeed in whatever you do. Find something that you like.
So that you can work hard.
Yes.
Yeah.
I completely agree with you. And tell me, please, I see that you have a lot of books behind you. So what book would you recommend our listeners to read?
So a book I read recently that I found very fun was The Invention of Nature by Andrea Wolf, which is the story of Alexander von Humboldt. And it's a story about adventure, about travel, about exploration, about science. It's about measurement, very meticulous, almost obsessive measurements of anything he could measure in nature. And yeah, it's a way of doing research that is rare now. Research that takes years, lots of observation, lots of record keeping, and with eventually patterns emerging from that process. And it's a very, very interesting story about Alexander von Humboldt, who is a very important figure in the sciences in general. So I enjoyed it a lot. It's fun. So that's the one I recommend.
Great. I will put a link in the end of the seminar. So Tomás, thank you so much. It was very interesting and thought-provoking talk. And I hope to see you in our other seminar meetings. So again,
Great.
thank you for your time.
Thank you, Yefin. And I see you in the next seminar.
Definitely.